All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Filippo Zil. I am a senior developer evangelist at Salesforce, and I'll be your host for the next 20 minutes. Today, we're going to talk about JavaScript, and we're going to talk about how you can write less code and safer code with ECMAScript, the latest standards in JavaScript. Before I go into the presentation, I'm a Salesforce employee, and we are a publicly traded company, so I do have to give you a forward-looking statement. We are a publicly traded company, so everything that I will tell you in this presentation is not related to product, but please do make your purchasing decision based on what is commercially available. We are not going to talk about Salesforce products, so we should be safe. On our agenda today, two parts mainly. I'm going to talk a bit about the history of JavaScript and why I wrote this talk, and then I will talk about the technical side. I will not bombard you with code, I'll try not to, but I will give you a few pointers that are part of ECMAScript that can help you build better code with a few tips. Things like variable scoping, arrow functions, and array functions. These are just a subset of ECMAScript features that are very powerful that you can use, and you can use it in Lightning with a few considerations, and I'll finish with those considerations at the end of the presentation. So first of all, I'd like to give you an overview of why I gave this talk. As a developer evangelist, I'm connected with the developer community, and I see a lot of code written in JavaScript, even more with the rise of Lightning adoption. People write a lot of JavaScript. We used a bit of JavaScript before in Visualforce, but now with Lightning, everything is about JavaScript. The problem with that is that I see a lot of contributions that are dealing with poor code practices, and generally also low code quality. So I thought maybe I can do something in a short amount of time, like 20 minutes, to improve a bit the practices of developers. Because what I've seen so far is that some code is being written with techniques that are dating back from 2000 and before, so that's the previous millennia, or the previous decade. That is a long time ago. So I want to give this talk to give you a few pointers about how you can upgrade a bit your JavaScript skills without going into a full course to get up to speed with ECMAScript. Now, the reason why people use old code practices is that there's a specific link to the history of JavaScript. So I'm going to go a really short history course about JavaScript and technology. It all started in 1995, and I don't know if you are aware of it, but it started as Mocha, that was the original name for JavaScript, and then it got renamed to LiveScript, and finally to JavaScript, all of that in 1 year. So they were very active, and they changed their mind a lot. The first version of JavaScript was released in Netscape, so that's a very old browser. But this started the rise of JavaScript. From then on, JavaScript rose in prominence, and the idea at the time was actually to give an alternative to Java. Java was targeted to developers, enterprise developers, so it was requiring a lot of knowledge and training. And so we wanted to have something that was a flexible, a light scripting language for designers, which are not necessarily developers. And Netscape was working at the time with Sun Microsystems, so that's why you have the name JavaScript, which contains Java. But although it's not Java, it has some similarities to it, thus can the naming. So it started with Netscape, and then Internet Explorer and Microsoft realized that it was gaining traction, so they released their own version of JavaScript called JScript. Now, you may not know it, but JavaScript is actually a copyright, it's a name, but it's copyrighted by Netscape. So Microsoft Internet Explorer could not use this name, they had to use JScript at the time. So a year later, they followed with the adoption of this technology. And then, of course, other browsers trying to use it. Now, as the number of users and vendors that supported JavaScript grew, they decided to agree on a set of standards. And first came ECMAScript. ECMAScript is the normative name of JavaScript. That's the standard, basically, that defines the different properties that each vendor must implement to support JavaScript. So the first standard came in 1997, and then year after year they created new versions of the standard. Each year they basically had a new version. But the problem came after 99. In 99, basically, there's a start of a new age, a dark age, where there was no innovation at all on JavaScript, and you will see that. It started a very bad trend. In 2000, from 2000 to 2005, they started to work on the next generation of JavaScript. It was called ECMAScript 4. So it took 5 years, it failed twice, and in the end they gave up. In parallel to that, there was a group of companies that were part of the consortium which tried to set up the new ECMAScript standard. that forked from the original group, and they said, rather than write a new version of the standard, let's try to fork it and do something smaller, just a small update to ECMAScript 3. We'll call it 3.1, and hopefully it will be smaller, it will be able to deliver it. But even that did not work. And only in 2011 did they all come back together and agree on building the next generation standard, which was called ECMAScript 5. So you can see that for 10 years, from 2000 to 2011, basically nothing happened in the JavaScript world. And this is why I think people don't have always the latest skills. They're stuck with pre-2000 standard. And here I'm hoping in this talk to give you a bit of pointers on how you can reach up and get up to speed. Now, with the arrival of ECMAScript 5, it started a new trend, a new movement, a new energy in the community. And it started a new era of standards. So we picked up with the innovation pace that we initially got in 1997. And from 2015 to 2017, we brought several generations of standards, ECMAScript being the most popular one right now from 2015, and then 2016 and 2017, 6 and 7. Now, I won't talk about what is really latest generation. I will stick to ECMAScript 6 and 5 for the rest of the talk. But be aware that things are evolving, and now we're in a rapid pace of innovation now. So things are picking up. So I'm going to get now into the technical side of the presentation. I will talk about code. And I will talk about what are a few things from ECMAScript that we can use in our code to make it better. The first thing is variable scoping. 99% of the code that we can see in contributions online around Lightning or other technology are generally using only var. But did you know that there are other types of variable scopes that you can use? There are let and const, and these are actually very, very useful. Myself, now, I never use var at all. You actually don't need to use var, and I'm going to show you why this is dangerous. When you use var, it's called a global variable, and that means it is visible to all scopes when you declare a variable. So here in the code sample I wrote, you can see that we declare a variable a, but we declare it inside an if statement. Even if we declare it inside an if statement, it is visible in the upper scopes. So this is dangerous because this can give you really things that you did not predict. So instead of using vars, which can give this kind of behavior, we can use let. Let acts pretty much as var, except that if you use it outside of its scope, it will throw an error, but the variable is not defined. So that is a bit more what you would expect. So simple, 3 letters, you just replace var by let in your code everywhere. And if your code structure is well formatted, if you're not using like references in upper scope, things should be transparent. Now, what I use almost all the time now is the final and third keyword, the const keyword. The const, as its name implies, is not exactly constant, no. It's kind of a mix of a constant and something which is variable. So the first thing that is actually the behavior of a constant is that it cannot be reassigned. If you assign it a value when you declare it, you cannot assign a new value to it. This will throw an error. If you assign 2 after having declared 1 as the initial value, this will throw an error. So that is good because sometimes you don't want to override a value. But as I said before, it's not exactly a constant. So it is something we call mutable. You can change its value. You cannot reassign it, but you can change its value. So if we declare an object to b, for example, with a property value, we're still able to change the value of the key value of b. So that's something you have to consider and be careful about. It's not always constant. So these are the 3 types of scopes you can use. I suggest you move to let and const in your code. So there are very simple changes, and actually this will probably give you more errors, but it will give you more predictable code. So I suggest you adopt those. Then the next thing you should adopt is called arrow functions. Arrow functions are very powerful. It's something, if you look at it from the first glance, it's something that is like a shorter syntax for functions. Here I've written the traditional syntax for writing a function that does multiply. We all seen that. We're actually all using it. But this can be actually trimmed down to an arrow function. So you see here, there's a new symbol that is introduced. It's called a fat arrow with an equal and a superior symbol. And this does exactly the same thing as the function syntax. But this can actually be simplified to something even shorter. This syntax here is the shortest syntax you can get with an arrow function. This syntax is absolutely equivalent to the first one. So that's the first aspect of arrow functions. You can shorten down a bit your code, make it simpler. But then there's another powerful aspect that people don't always know about arrow functions that is even more powerful. functions are affecting the binding of the this keyword. So let's take a look at some code. I know it's a bit cut on the side. Oh, it's only on my screen here. Okay, anyway. So what I'm doing here, I'm declaring a constant object. I'm assigning a property A, and I'm calling a function f with some logging. I'm logging the value of A. So what do you think will happen? The first time we call the function, well, A will be 1. But do you know what will happen when we log the second time? The second time is actually logged inside a set timeout function, and we actually have a function that is declared inside a function. This is totally fine, we can do that, but this impacts the binding of the this keyword. So if you do that, if you execute this code, you'll get undefined at this point. That's because of the way functions behave. When you declare a function inside a function, you're affecting the scope of this keyword. So if you don't want to get into this problem, the only way to do it is actually to create a variable, whether it is a const or let or whatever, and do a reference to the this object, and use this reference inside your second function, so that you keep a reference to the original this pointer. So that works, but it's just a bit of a pain because you have to write another variable. Of course, here I've called it that, but there's no specific syntax. You can call it this, or no, this. You can call it apple, whatever, paper, whatever. So that will work. That will give you 1 as expected. But that's not very convenient. So if we replace the following code with an arrow function, we don't get into this problem of the this.a being undefined inside timeout. So this is the second property of arrow functions that is very, very powerful. Each time you have a function that is inside a function, you can easily replace it with an arrow function, and you don't lose the binding to the this keyword. If I draw the parallel to this in Lightning, if you're having functions being called inside, for example, a helper in your Lightning component, you'll have this problem, and you'll have to save a reference to the help component, and then you can pass it to the subfunction. But if you use an arrow function, you don't have this problem. Final piece of information I want to give you for the ECMAScript features are array functions. And array functions actually work great with arrow functions. We've all been in a situation in which we have to filter a large collection of objects. Find, for example, in an array an object with a specific key. And to do that, generally we write a lot of code like this one. Here I declare an array A with a list of objects, and each of these objects have a key, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. And to find an object within this array of objects, I need to call this function findItemWithKey. So I have to write all of this. There's a good chance that I make a mistake in my iteration, that I make a mistake in my check, but I don't write efficient code. So what can I do? Well, I can use an array function, the findArray function, to do exactly that in a single line of code. I combine my array function with an arrow function, and I can easily filter an object with a specific key value. What I wrote here in a single line is how I can extract the value that matches an item with key equal to. So how does this work? Basically, for each element of the array, we're going to evaluate the expression that is inside find. We call an arrow function. This arrow function transfers each item of A into item, and then we evaluate a Boolean expression for that. Now, as soon as the Boolean expression returns true, we return the item that was found. So this does what the previous code does, but it's a single one-liner, and there's no risk of error. The advantage also is that it's very flexible. Here we're filtering on the key, but if you need to filter on another attribute, you can just write another one-liner. You don't have to duplicate your code. So the object we found here is the object. Of course, we have the key, but we have also the other properties of the object. That's very simple to use, and it's super efficient. Now, on top of that, we have other array functions. I'm not going to be able to list all of them, but I'm going to give you 2 more that are very useful. The next one that I found very useful is the map array function. So we take the same array again. We can use the map array function to extract a portion of this array and to transform it. So here, for example, if we take our array and we want to call a map statement, we can actually take each item and concatenate something to the key and return the new array. So we return an array that has the same number of elements as the original array, but that contains different elements. So here we only kept the key attribute. We did not keep the other attributes. So we have an array of string in the end instead of an array of objects. But both arrays have the same size. This is good if you want to transform information, if you want to add extra information, or even if you want to call another function on it. Because here I wrote it as a one-liner, but remember it's an arrow function. So we could have a whole block of logic. Instead of doing key plus item.key, we can call a complex bit of code here. And finally, one other array function that is very useful. It's similar to the find function. It's called the filter function. The filter functions behaves in the same way as the find, except that it filters more than one result. The find function will stop as soon as it finds one object that matches the condition, the filtering condition, but the filter will actually filter more than that. So here I wrote another function to filter. We're using the modulus operator to filter basically even values. So we only extract even key values from our array list. So we get only the key values with key 2, 4, 6, 8, etc., etc. That's another way to write it down. So these are just a couple of the array functions. There are more than that. There's a big list. And there are also a lot more features in ECMAScript. But I have to conclude. So now I'm going to give you a few pointers about how you can use the few bits of information I gave you and more in Lightning. So the first thing you want to know when you use this in Lightning, you have to be mindful about browser compatibility. The features I've shown you so far in this presentation are perfectly safe to use in Lightning for all kinds of browsers, because they're basically, they expect Internet Explorer 11 or higher, so you can use them in any browser that connects to Salesforce. But if you look at more recent ECMAScript features, like, for example, string templating. String templating is a feature that allows you to inject dynamic values inside a string. So you can concatenate values, you can use a caller function inside a string to build a larger string. These features are part of ECMAScript, and they are actually not supported by all browsers. So you have to remember that. What is the target browser that your users are going to use, and what feature can I use? Next, another thing that is very important and very tricky is to figure out which features are supported by Lightning. Lightning isn't directly run inside your user's browser. There's a first validation that goes on the server side. There is some compilation that occurs on the server side. This is because we want to make sure that your code is valid, doesn't break your UI, so it doesn't cover all possible errors, but at least there's a pre-validation. You probably all have written some code in which you forgot a comma, like maybe an open parenthesis or something. So this is what gets picked up by the compiler. This won't allow you to save your Lightning component. It's going to be executed on the Salesforce side, on the backend side. Now, not all of these ECMAScript features are supported by the compiler. So even though they would work in your user's browsers, the compiler of the Lightning component might fail and give you some errors. To give you some examples about these kind of errors, you cannot use arrow functions as the first level functions in your helpers and controllers.
Trading Post line will be closing at 5:45 p.m. today. This will be your last chance to redeem prizes until tomorrow.
All right. So I was saying you cannot use arrow functions as the first level functions inside your controller or in your helper. You can use them in lower levels, but we expect to have full function declaration on the first level. Another thing that you cannot use, or is a bit tricky to use, is default function values, default function parameter values. In ECMAScript, you can assign a default value if you forget to specify a parameter to a function. This works by saying my parameter name equals a default value. So if you don't specify this parameter, it gets overwritten by the default value. This works in Lightning, but it works with a specific syntax, which is not the official syntax. In Lightning, you have to put no space between the variable name, the parameter name, and the default value, and it will work. If you do put a space in there, it won't work. That's because we don't officially support ECMAScript. So these are things to consider. I haven't covered the entire spectrum of ECMAScript features here, but there are some cases in which it won't behave as you would expect to in Lightning. Now, everything again that I showed in these slides, the arrow functions, the const var and let, and the array functions, all of these are supported in Lightning. So I suggest that you use those. It's very easy to adopt, and I think it saves you a lot of time. With that, I'd like to conclude. So I think I've shown you a bit how JavaScript has evolved and how we actually need to retrain ourselves, because we've been stuck with practices from the previous decade, and a decade is very long in terms of software history. So we need to refresh a bit our knowledge. We don't necessarily need to use high-end or really cutting-edge technology, but at least see a few basics. And there's a very great document that you can grab here from the Mozilla Foundation. It gives you a refresher on ECMAScript. So if you know things from 2000 and before, read this document. It's a bit long, and it covers things that you may not need, but it's a good way to refresh your training and see what you can do to write safer and less code with ECMAScript. With that, I'd like to thank you. If you enjoyed this session, please rate it, and I will be taking questions. Thank you.